Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Technology can boost competition and help consumers. It's undermined the newspaper, virtually wiped out travel agents and hurt retailers. BHS could be said to be a victim. We'll be talking about that later. But the revolution is not over. It's hitting minicabs and hotels through companies like Uber and Airbnb. Now you can embrace it or resist it. And today, the European Commission took a stand in favour of embracing it. It declared that EU member states should not be unduly restricting companies in the so-called collaborative economy or banning them except as a last resort. The verdict was aimed at cities that have tried to restrict Uber or Airbnb. But the Commission view will only exacerbate the arguments over those services and the fears of some here that their uncontrolled explosion will disrupt businesses, lives and livelihoods. It is Uber that has caused the biggest arguments. Private hire minicabs on demand via an app. Convenient, sometimes cheap, cashless. It operates in cities and towns across the country, but it is having most of its effect in London. The sheer numbers of drivers signing on to it in the capital are huge. Since 2013, 25,000 drivers have hit the streets. That's equal to the number of black cabs. The drivers are self-employed and work flexible hours. They just pay a commission to Uber of 25% of takings for the privilege. When an Uber comes along and whacks an existing industry as Uber has, there will of course be complaints, and a lot of those complaints will be dismissed. But the company does raise a really important issue. Is it creating an Uber competitive society? Because the technology it deploys does enable a huge increase in the supply of drivers, of labour in the taxi industry. Now, that's great for customers, of course, but it does imply a change in the balance of power between labour and consumer. For the workers, of course, the fear is it just creates a race to the bottom.
Minicabs have begun to invade the streets of London. Small cars charging a third less than ordinary cabs. Taxi drivers think, blimey, they'll be using scooters next.
All new services cause problems. This is from 1961, when the cabbies resisted the arrival of minicabs on London streets.
By law, minicabs can't pick up fares.
But as we see opposition today, the question arises, is the economy Uber is helping to shape having effects on a different scale and at a different speed to anything we've known? Well, the EU Commission policy is that the Ubers of the world should not be stopped or restricted with disproportionate burdens. Earlier today, I spoke to the woman who runs Uber in the UK and several other European countries, Jo Bertram. First question, what was her reaction to the Commission policy?
It's great to see that the European Commission is looking forward and embracing the collaborative economy and starting to issue some guidelines on this area. It's obviously something that's happening not only in transportation but in many other sectors, and great to see the Commission embrace that.
And of course there is a concern that there are just going to be too many people touting for passenger hire on the roads of London. So is it your position that you will limit the number, or will you just let the numbers grow? If the drivers are there to do it, you'll just let them sign on to your app and be driver?
Oh, we want to make sure that the opportunity to earn money at the touch of a button continues to be there for drivers. And obviously, if there were too many drivers compared to the number of people wanting to use the app, then they wouldn't be able to earn enough money. There was some interesting research just done by INRIX, actually, about congestion in London, where they found that actually the numbers of car vehicles going in and out of the congestion charge, but also central London, hasn't actually changed over recent years. So it suggests that, if anything, the growth of companies like Uber is replacing people who would have otherwise took their private car into the capital.
Okay. Let me ask you this, do you know how many of your drivers earn less than minimum wage per hour?
It's probably not a good comparison, because essentially all of the drivers are free to use the platform whenever they want, as much or as little as they want, and on a completely non-exclusive basis. So most drivers work part-time. They also combine this with starting their own business or other sources of income or other family commitments. And they may use their car, their vehicle that they use for Uber, with other operators as well.
But it's not difficult to find Uber drivers who say they are earning less than the minimum wage per hour. Does that surprise you?
I know there are a few that say that. It obviously depends a lot where and when they work. What we find is, on average, the drivers working in London take home, after the service fee, £15 or £16 an hour.
After all their costs?
After the service
fuel,
fee. Now,
just
their
after
costs,
your service fee?
Yes, after the service
and what are they
fee.
taking home after their costs?
Well, it depends hugely on their costs and whether...
You must know the answer to that. You must have researched it and know what the drivers are getting.
We have, but again, for example, if you own your car and you're using that to work with us and another private hire operator.
Just the average that the drivers are earning after the costs, the reasonable costs have been deducted, after what they pay you. Do you know the answer?
We
know
the answer, but it's probably not a mean. I mean, for example, if you own your own car and you work 30 or 40 hours a week, there's, you could well be taking home much more than someone who is renting their car and is only, working a few hours a week.
Well, let's take someone who owns the car. You said you know the answer. I mean, what are they roughly getting per hour that they're working on Uber? I mean, it's a data business, yours.
Yes,
it's a computer business.
It depends how many hours a week they work. So they pay their fixed costs over the month and their insurance.
And let's suppose they're doing a 40-hour week. Is that?
They could easily be taking home £9 or £10 an hour.
And what proportion of them could be taking home less than £6 an hour?
We don't know the details of exactly how many drivers rent and how many hours they work. Unfortunately, because of the way the private hire regime works in the UK, is you do probably need to work a certain number of hours a week.
If you get to 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 drivers on the streets, one would expect that the rates each driver's getting will go down.
Well, only if the demand doesn't rise in a similar way. 30,000 riders are downloading and using the app for the first time every week in London. The demand for the services has been huge. And we're actually hearing, we've done some polling of drivers recently, and the results were amazingly positive. And the biggest thing that was coming out from that was the drivers really valuing that complete flexibility. Most drivers coming to us from other operators tell us that they moved because they don't want to have set shifts and set hours, and they want to be able to take holiday and switch off when they can. They can literally now get work at the touch of a button.
Can I ask, because you are a data-driven business, do you know how many of your drivers are working more than 60 hours a week?
I don't have those numbers, but on average, the drivers use the app about 28 hours a week.
On average, it's 28. I saw that, but this is one of those ones where I don't mind whether they're working 28. I don't mind if they're working 40. I don't really mind if they're working 45. I don't want to get in a car where the driver's working 70 or 80 hours a week.
Yeah.
Can you tell whether they're working 70 or 80 hours?
Yeah, we can see.
Do you stop them working 70?
We make sure that we monitor the hours that drivers are working, and that we notify them if they're working excessive hours.
Do you stop them though if they're working 70 or 80 hours?
Well, it's quite difficult to know. I mean, if they're logged onto the app versus if they're taking trips and things like that. But what we also have is after every.
If they're driving and.
We can tell when they're logged on, but they might also just be logged on at home. But I mean, what we can have is after.
But I think you can tell when they're driving, can't you? I mean, you can see the car.
You can see if they're doing trips. But what we find is that after every single trip, we have the customer rating the driver, so we get that real-time feedback that no other companies have to see how the driver's performing.
But I don't know whether my driver has driven 80 hours that week when I take an Uber. I can't tell whether he's driven 80 hours. I can tell you that he hasn't crashed while I've been in the car, but I would hold you to a higher standard than that.
Of course, and I
would expect you to know that the driver hasn't driven 80 hours because you know when the driver's driving. That's one of the great things about your app. Now, I'm surprised that you don't know, or you don't tell the driver, get out the car because you've driven 80 hours this week.
Well, exactly. So we monitor the hours that the drivers work and notify them and make sure that they're not working excessive hours.
You notify them, or you instruct them, or you just log them off if they've done 80 hours, say. We
notify them, and we actually talk with them and look through their driving behaviours and if there's any safety concerns and things like that. But essentially, all those drivers are independent business people who are running their own business and combining it with many other things as well.
Do you think the scale of the disruption that Uber is causing rightly causes people to say, let's have a think about how this is working. This isn't some Joe's minicab office. This is a company with 30,000 people at its fingertips. I mean, what do you think about the sniping?
I believe that competition is good. It's good for consumers, and I think we've all seen that. I mean, if 3-4 years ago, you couldn't have got a car within 3 minutes anywhere in London and many of the other cities in the UK. I think the one thing that worries me is, I think in some of this, that the drivers' stories are not being heard. Because, I mean, genuinely, every time I get in a car, I talk to the drivers, and the stories of how they've used Uber to change their lives are really inspiring, and it's something they really value and appreciate. And I think we want to find a way to tell also those positive stories, not just the handful of drivers that are unhappy.
Joe Bertram, thank you very much. Thanks. Well, I'm joined now by the economist Anne Pettifer, Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics and a member of Labour's Economic Advisory Committee, and also by the venture capitalist Julie Meyer, who specialises in funding innovative technology firms. Anne Pettifer, I could see your kind of face frowning up as you listened to that interview. Do you really think Uber is a force for bad in our society?
I do, and it's not because of the relationship between the driver and the consumer. And I think the consumer benefits from this, and obviously there is demand for this form of transportation. It's the relationship between Uber in California via a smartphone, the remoteness of a smartphone, and these drivers who invest all the capital in the venture. They buy the car, they pay for the petrol, they pay the insurance or don't pay the insurance. So they are the capitalists, they're investing in these assets. And someone up there in Santa Monica, California, is diverting the cash flow from that, 25% of that. So it's an extraordinary thing.
But no one forces the driver to give 25% to Uber. They have to log on to the app to do that.
As Ms. Bertram said, these drivers are probably flipping burgers during the day and earning very little and having to supplement their incomes. And it's about what's happening to our economy, the flattening of incomes, the lowering of incomes, the lowering of prices, which in the end is bad for business.
But before I come to Julie, I just want to say one thing. I mean, can you draw the distinction between workers and consumers that you're drawing? Because these drivers who are low paid may be going to a low-cost supermarket that has squeezed down prices, or they may be getting on a low-cost airline, or they may be themselves beneficiaries of the economy that has squeezed prices.
No, I mean, the distinction isn't between the workers and the consumers, the drivers and the consumers. They are both being milked, if you like. I mean, the consumers are getting a cheap ride, but at risk. They're taking the risks because they're not sure either whether they've done 80 hours a day already driving, and either whether they've got insurance and whether they're covered. Right. And there's also the risks of women picking up all of this stuff in the middle of the night.
Those are familiar risks in taxi business.
So the consumer's taking the risk.
So
the driver's investing
I will
the
come
capital.
to Julie, but how is the consumer taking a risk? The consumer just pays perhaps a cheaper fare for a convenient taxi.
It's cheap, and it's very convenient. I'm not denying that. The key relationship is between this remote capitalist milking, if you like, a whole cash flow, corralling a whole cash flow, not just from one industry, but from a whole sector.
Is that how you see it, Julie?
No, not at all. I mean, it is a fact today that the world is being driven by networks. So what Uber, Airbnb, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, all of these companies are networks and they're platforms, and that's the future. We can't stop that from happening. Now, the interesting thing is that these platforms are enabling people with excess capacity, a spare bedroom in the case of Airbnb, I know how to drive, and so forth, to leverage their freedom and that excess capacity in order to make money. So people, if you have a free bedroom, if you know how to drive, you can't say that you can't make money and you can't get a job, because there's an ability to earn money. And so what I see happening is that you can choose to optimize, right? There's an optimization model to optimize for the platform in California, to optimize for BlaBlaCar in France, to optimize for the driver's salary. Those decisions about who makes, more money, it's an optimization play.
But just, Julie Meyer, do you think that the commission that an Uber charges, which as I understand actually is not significantly out of line with other minicab proprietors, but is that commission for what they've brought to the party, which is this pretty sophisticated piece of software, is their bit, which is 25% or 20% of the ride, is their bit a fair return for what they've done?
Well, Uber is the fastest growing company in the history of the planet. In the history of humanity, it's the fastest growing. They have enabled people to become drivers. They've enabled the future infrastructure of the transportation industry. What's fair? What's fair is that they are determining the economics of this three-way split between the driver, the passenger, and Uber. So that's why they're winning. But that's why they're winning. So the point is just that the black cab industry could have done that, the Addison Lees could have done that, all sorts of people could have done that, but they didn't.
They differ not one little bit from the old robber barons that used to, in the medieval times, stand by the road that went through their land and collect the toll.
Here's an idea then. Here's an idea, Anne. What you could do is if it's so easy and so simple to set up a network like this, you could set one up, or you could ask someone to set one up, and then it could be called something else, and you could take a smaller commission.
I give them credit for the network. I give them credit for the app and the technology. What I think should happen is that the drivers should form their own workers' association and negotiate their own terms. Right, okay. The terms get set by Santa Monica
that is a very interesting point,
in California.
Actually, we didn't run that bit of the interview, but they basically say, when I did ask her about that, Joe Burton said, we really prefer to talk to the drivers one-on-one rather than as a collective. Now, that obviously is a weakening of labour power.
Well, and there'll be certain geographies where those attempts to do that will happen. But what is a fact, and I think what's interesting as a social trend, as a macro trend, is that we're going to see that the winners in any industry, whether it's transportation or hotels and so forth, are going to be the organizations who organize the economics for these ecosystems. And so we're going to see this in banking, in insurance, in retail, and so forth. Just because Uber does it super well.
That's a utopian idea.
No, it's a fact.
The idea
it's just a fact.
It is a fact
today.
For the moment.
The ecosystems are the economics of these ecosystems happen to be being organized by Uber, Facebook, and so forth. It could be the banks in the future, it could be the retailers, but they have to understand what the problem and the solution is, and they have to work with entrepreneurs to do it.
It's a delusional utopian ideal, and it is working at the moment. It is a fact at the moment.
It is.
But what do we see? We see Donald Trump in the United States, we see Mrs. Le Pen in France. The people are rising up against this market fundamentalism.
It has nothing to do with a
narcissist
narcissist by the name of Donald Trump.
Law and
regulation. It has nothing to do with a narcissist by the name of Donald Trump. Nothing to do with him.
It's got a lot to do with it.
It's fascinating and interesting topic that raises great emotion and intellectual issues. Both of you, thank you very much indeed.
I've been getting